Now you talk about terror. I've been terrorized all my day. Hammer all my day.
Hi, I'm Chris Hedges. Welcome to Days of Revolt. Today, in a two-part series, we're going to be discussing the great Ponzi scheme that defines the not only U.S. but global economy, how we got there in the first segment, and secondly, where we're going. And with me to discuss this issue is the economist Michael Hudson, author of Killing the Host: How Financial Parasites and Debt Destroy the Global Economy, a professor of economics who worked for many years on Wall Street, where you don't succeed if you don't grasp Marx's dictum that capitalism is about exploitation. And he is also, I should mention, the godson of Leon Trotsky. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I want to open this discussion by reading a passage from your book, which I admire very much, which I think gets to the core of what you discuss. You write, Adam Smith long ago remarked that profits often are highest in nations going fastest to ruin. There are many ways to create economic suicide on a national level. The major way throughout history has been by indebting the economy. Debt always expands to reach a point where it cannot be paid by large swaths of the economy. This is the point where austerity is imposed and ownership of wealth polarizes between the 1% and the 99%. Today is not the first time this has occurred in history, but it is the first time that running into debt has occurred deliberately, applauded, as if most debtors can get rich by borrowing, not reduced to a condition of debt peonage. So let's start with classical economics who certainly understood this. They were reacting, of course, to feudalism. And what happened to the study of economics so that it became gamed by ideologues?
Well, the essence of classical economics was to reform industrial capitalism, to streamline it, and to free the European economies from the legacy of feudalism. And the legacy of feudalism were landlords that were extracting land rent and living as a class that took income without producing anything. And the banks, which were not funding industry, the leading industrialists from James Watt with the steam engine to the railroads, none of them could get money from the banks.
From your book, you make the point that banks almost never funded industry.
That's the point, that they never had. And by the time you got to Marx, later in the 19th century, you had a whole discussion, largely in Germany, over how do we make banks do something they didn't do under feudalism. Right now, we're having the economic surplus being drained by the landlords and drained by the bondholders. Adam Smith was very much against colonialism, and because that led to wars, and he was against wars because that led to public debt. And he said the solution to prevent this financial class of bondholders burdening down the economy by imposing more and more taxes on consumer goods every time they went to war was to finance wars on a pay-as-you-go basis. Instead of borrowing, you'd tax the people then. He thought that if everybody felt the burden of war, then in the form of paying taxes, they'd be against it. Well, it took all of the 19th century to fight for democracy and to extend the vote so that instead of the landlords controlling the parliament and the lawmaking and the tax system through the House of Lords, you'd extend the vote to labor, to women, to everybody. So on the theory that society as a whole would vote in its own self-interest, and it would vote for the 99%, not for the 1%. And so by the time Marx wrote in the 1870s, he could already see what was happening in Germany, that the German banks were indeed trying to make money in conjunction with the government by lending to heavy industry, largely to the military-industrial
This was Bismarck.
complex.
Bismarck's kind of social, I don't know what we call it. It was a form of capitalist socialism.
Well, they
or
called
something.
it state capitalism.
State capitalism.
And there was a long discussion by Engels saying, wait a minute, state socialism or state capitalism isn't what we mean by socialism. And there are two kinds of state-oriented.
But I should just interject. I mean, there was a kind of brilliance behind Bismarck's policy because he created pension funds, he provided health benefits, and he directed banking towards industry, towards the industrialization of Germany, which, as you point out, was very different in Britain and the United States.
Well, the German banking was so successful that by the time World War I broke out, there were discussions in the English journals saying, we're worried that Germany and the Axis powers are going to win because their banks are more suited to fund industry, and without industry you can't have really a military, whereas the British banks only lend for foreign trade, they lend for speculation, and the stock market is a hit-and-run operation. They want quick in and out to make the profits, whereas the German banks don't insist that their clients pay as much dividends.
Right.
The German banks own stocks as well as bonds, and there's much more of a partnership. And that's what most of the 19th century imagined was going to happen, that the world was on the way towards socializing banking, towards moving capitalism beyond the feudal epoch and getting rid of the landlord class, getting rid of the rent, getting rid of interest, and really it was going to be labor and capital, profits and wages, with the profits being reinvested in more capital, and you'd have an expansion of technology. And around the early 20th century, most futurists imagined that we'd be living in a leisure economy by now.
Including Karl Marx.
That's right. Yeah, 10-hour work week. And
Right.
to Marx, socialism was just the reformed state of capitalism at the time.
But that isn't what happened in large part because of the defeat of Germany in World War I, but also because we took the understanding of economists like Adam Smith and maybe Keynes, and I don't know who you would blame for this, whether it's Ricardo or others, and we created a fictitious economic form or economic theory that erased rentier or rent-derived, interest-derived capitalism and counted it as a productive force within the economy. Perhaps you can address that.
Well, here's what happened. Marx sort of traumatized classical economics by taking the concepts of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and the others and pushing them to the logical conclusion. He said that the progressive capitalism, people called Ricardian socialists like John Stuart Mill, said, okay, we want to tax away the land or nationalize it. We want to have the government take over the heavy industry and build infrastructure to provide low-cost basic services. This was traumatizing the landlord class and the 1%, and they fought back. Now, none of the classical economists could even imagine how on earth can the feudal interests, these great vested interests and that had all this money, actually fight back and succeed. They thought the future was going to belong to capital and labor. And around the late 19th century, certainly in America, you had people like John Bates Clark come out with a completely different theory. The whole classical economics, what made Adam Smith and the physiocrats and John Stuart Mill,
Physiocrats, should explain, are the French, these enlightened French economists.
Well, the common denominator among all the classical economists was the distinction between earned income and unearned income. And the unearned income was rent and interest. The earned income were wages and profits. Well, John Bates Clark came and said, there's no such thing as unearned income. The landlord actually earns the money by taking all this effort to provide a house and a land to renters, and the banks provide credit and their interest. Every kind of income is, everybody earns their income, so anyone who accumulates wealth, by definition, according to his formulas, get rich by adding to what is now called gross domestic product.
And I think one of the points you make in your book, which I liked, was that in almost all cases, those who had the capacity to make money parasitically off interest and rent had either, if you go back to the origins, looted and seized the land by force or inherited it.
That's correct. In other words, the unearned income. Well, the result of this sort of anti-classical revolution that you had just before World War I was that today almost all of the economic growth in the last decade has gone to the 1%. It's gone to Wall Street, real estate.
But you blame this on what you call junk economics.
Well, the junk economics was the anti-classical reaction.
And explain a little bit how, in essence, that's a fictitious form of measuring the economy.
Well, suppose you have a crook and you're going to the bank. I went to a block away. We had a Chase Manhattan Bank, and I used to bank there. I took out money from the bank, and as I was going out, two pickpocket, one pushed me over, and the other grabbed the money and ran out. I was 10 feet from the teller. The guard stood there. And so I naturally asked for the money back and said, look, I was robbed in your bank right in front. And they said, well, we don't arm our guards because if they shot one of the people, the thief could sue us, and we don't want to do that. We'll just give you money back. Well, imagine if you count all of this crime, all the money that's taken, as an addition to GDP, because now the crook has provided the service of not pushing me down or not stabbing me. Or suppose somebody's held up at an ATM machine, your money or your life. Okay, here's the money. The crook has given you the choice of your life. Well, in a way, that's how the gross national product accounts are put up. You have Wall Street extracting money from the economy. You have landlords extracting...
Let's go back. They're extracting money from the economy by debt peonage, by raising...
By not playing a productive role,
right?
Basically.
So it's credit card interest, mortgage interest, car loans, student loans. That's how they make their funds.
That's right. And so they don't, money is not a factor of production. But in order to have access to credit, in order to get the money, in order to get an education, you have to pay the banks.
Right.
And at New York University here, for instance, they have Citibank. I think Citibank people were on the board of directors of NYU. You get the students when they come here to start at the local bank. And once you are in a bank and have monthly funds taken out of your account for electric utilities or whatever, it's very hard to change. So basically you have what the classical economists called the rentier class, the class that lives on economic rents. Landlords, monopolists charging more, and the banks. So that if you have a pharmaceutical company such that raises the rate of a drug from $12 a shot to $200, that's all of a sudden their profits go up. Their increased price for the drug is counted in the national income accounts as if the economy is producing more. So all of this presumed economic growth that has all been taken by the 1% in the last 10 years. And people say the economy is growing, but the economy isn't growing.
Because it's not reinvested.
That's right. It's not production. It's not consumption. Right. The wealth of the 1% is obtained by essentially lending money to the 99% and then charging interest on it and recycling this interest at a exponentially growing rate.
And why is it important, as I think you point out in your book, that economic theory counts this rentier income as productive income? Explain why that's important.
If you're a rentier, you want to say that, hey, I earned my income by...
We're talking about Goldman Sachs, by the way.
Goldman Sachs.
Is perfect.
If you, well, yes, the head of Goldman Sachs came out and said, Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. That's why they're paid what they are. And the concept of productivity in America is the income divided by the labor. So if you're Goldman Sachs and you pay yourself $20 million a year in salary and bonuses, you're considered to have added 20 million to GDP, and that's enormously productive. So we're talking with tautology. We're talking of circular reasoning here. So the issue is whether Goldman Sachs, Wall Street, predatory pharmaceutical firms actually add to product or whether they're just exploiting the people. And that's why I called my book Parasitism, because the parasite, people think of the parasite as simply taking money out, taking sucking blood out of the host or taking money out of the economy. But in nature, it's much more complicated. The parasite can't simply come in and take something. First of all, it needs to numb. It has an enzyme that numbs the host, so the host doesn't even realize the parasite's there. And then the parasites have another enzyme that makes the host, it takes over the host's brain, and it makes the host imagine that the parasite is part of the body, that actually part of itself to be protected. Well, that's basically what Wall Street has done. It depicts itself as part of the economy, not as a wrapping around it, not as external to it, but actually is the part that's helping the body grow, and that actually is responsible for most of the growth, when in fact it's the parasite that's taking over the growth. So the result is an inversion of classical economics. It turns Adam Smith upside down. It says that what the classical economists said was unproductive parasitism actually is the real economy, and the parasites are labor and industry that get in the way of what the parasite wants, which is to reproduce itself, not help the host labor and capital.
And the classical economists like Adam Smith were quite clear that unless that rentier income, the money made by things like hedge funds, was heavily taxed and put back into the economy would ultimately go into a kind of tailspin. And I think the example of that, which you point out in your book, is what's happened in terms of large corporations with stock dividends and buybacks. And maybe you can explain that.
Well, there's an idea in sort of superficial textbooks in the public media that if companies make a large profit, that somehow they make it by being productive.
Which is still in textbooks, isn't it?
Yes, and also that if a stock price goes up, you're just capitalizing the profits, and the stock price reflects the productive role of the company. But that's not what's been happening in the last 10 years. Just in the last 2 years, 92% of corporate profits in America have been spent either on buying back their own stock or in paying out as dividends to raise the price of the stock.
And explain why they do this.
About 15 years ago at Harvard, a professor called Jensen said the way to ensure that corporations are run to make most efficiently is to make the managers increase the price of the stock. So if you give the managers stock options and you pay them not according to how much they're producing or making the company bigger or expanding production, but the price of the stock, then you'll have the corporation run efficiently, financial style. So the corporate managers find there are two ways that they can increase the price of the stock. The first thing is to cut back long-term investment and use the money instead to buy their own stock. And when you buy your own stock, that means you're not putting the money into capital formation, you're not building new factories, you're not hiring more labor. You can actually increase the stock price by firing labor. Temporarily, by using the income from the past just to buy the stock, fire the labor force if you can, work it more intensively, pay it out as dividends, and that basically is the corporate raiders model. You use the money to pay off the junk bond holders at high interest. And of course, this gets the company in such trouble after a while because there's no new investment, markets shrink, that you then go to the labor unions and say, gee, this company is really near bankruptcy, and we don't really want to have to fire you, and the way that you can keep your job is if we just downgrade your pensions, and instead of giving you what we promised, the defined benefit pensions, it's a defined contribution. You know what you pay every month, but you don't know what's going to come out at all. And so you wipe out the pension funds, push it on to the government, the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, and all of a sudden you use the money you were going to pay for pensions to pay as stock dividends and then push it up, and then the whole thing turns down and it's hollowed out. And you shrink and you collapse, but by that time, the managers will have left the company. Right. They will have taken their bonuses and salaries and run.
I want to read this quote from your book, written by David Harvey in A Brief History of Neoliberalism, and have you comment on it. The main substantive achievement of neoliberalism has been to redistribute rather than to generate wealth and income. Accumulation by dispossession. I mean the commodification and privatization of land, and the forceful expulsion of peasant populations, conversion of various forms of property rights, common, collective, state, etc., into exclusive private property rights, suppression of rights to the commons, colonial, neo-colonial, and the imperial processes of appropriation of assets, including natural resources, and usury, the national debt, and most devastating of all, the use of the credit system as a radical means of accumulation by dispossession. To this list of mechanisms, we may now add a raft of techniques, such as the extraction of rents from patents and intellectual property rights, and the diminution or erasure of various forms of common property rights, such as state pensions, paid vacations, and access to education and health care, won through a generation or more of class struggle. The proposal to privatize all state pension rights pioneered in Chile under the dictatorship is, for example, one of the cherished objectives of the Republicans in the U.S. This explains the kind of denouement, or the final end result, which you speak about in your book, is in essence allowing what you call the rentier, or the speculative class, to cannibalize the entire society until collapse.
Well, a property right is not a factor of production. Look at what happened in Chicago, the city where I grew up. Chicago didn't want to have to raise the taxes on real estate, especially on all of the expensive commercial real estate there. So the budget ran up a deficit. They needed money to pay the bondholders, and so they sold off the parking rights to have meters, along the curbs for the Chicago streets. Well, the result is that they sold to Goldman Sachs 75 years of the right to put up parking meters. So now the cost of living and doing business in Chicago was raised by having to pay off the parking meters. If Chicago is going to have a parade or something and block off the traffic, Chicago has to pay Goldman Sachs what it would have made if there wouldn't have been a close-off for parade. And all of a sudden, it's much more expensive to live in Chicago because of this. But this added expense of having to pay parking rights to Goldman Sachs to pay out interest to its bondholders is counted as increase in GDP because you've now created more product by charging more. If you sell off a road, a government or a local road, and you put up a toll booth and make it into a toll road, all of a sudden GDP goes up. If you go to war abroad and you spend more money on the military-industrial complex, all this is counted as increased production. None of this is really part of the production system of the capital and labor building more and more factories and producing more things that people need to live and to do business. All of this is overhead, but there's no distinction between wealth and overhead, and failing to draw that distinction means that the host doesn't realize that there's a parasite there. The host economy, the industrial economy, doesn't realize what the industrialists realized in the 19th century, that if you want to be an efficient economy and be low priced and undersell competitors, you have to cut your price by having the public sector provide roads freely, medical care freely, education freely. If you charge for all of these, then you get to the point that the economy U.S. economy is in today. If American workers who work for factories were to get all of their consumer goods for nothing, all of their food, transportation, clothing, furniture, everything for nothing, they still couldn't compete with Asians or other producers because they have to pay up to 40%, 43% of their income for rent or mortgage interest, 10% or more of their income for student loans, credit card debt, 15% of their paycheck is automatic withholding to pay Social Security to cut taxes on the rich or to pay for medical care. So Americans, you've built into the economy all of this overhead, and there's no distinction between growth and overhead, and it's all made America so high-priced that we're priced out of the market regardless of what trade policy we have.
And we should add that under this predatory form of economics, you game the system. So you privatize pension funds, you force them into the stock market, an overinflated stock market. But because of the way companies go public, it's the hedge fund managers who profit, and it's those citizens whose retirement savings are tied to the stock market who lose. And maybe we can just conclude by talking about how the system is fixed, not only in terms of burdening the citizen with debt peonage, but by then forcing them into the market to fleece them again.
Well, we talk about an innovation economy as if that makes money. Let's suppose you have an innovation and a company goes public. They go to Goldman Sachs and other companies, Wall Street investment banks, to underwrite the stock. They say we're going to issue the stock, say at $40 a share. What's considered a successful float is immediately the Goldman and the others will go to their insiders and they'll say, will you buy this stock? You'll guarantee it'll go up. A successful flotation doubles the price in one day, so that at the end of the day, the stock's selling for $80.
But they have the option to buy it before everyone else.
Yes.
And knowing that by the end of the day it'll be inflated and then they sell it off.
That's exactly right.
And so the pension funds come in and buy it at an inflated price, and then it goes back down.
It may go back down, or it may be that the company just was shortchanged from the very beginning. And here the important thing is that the Wall Street underwriting firm and the speculators that come in, that it rounds up, get more in a single day than all the years it took to put the company together.
Right.
The company gets 40%. These people get also $40. Other people get $40. So basically, you have the financial sector ending up with much more of the gains. And the name of the game, if you're on Wall Street, isn't profits. It's capital gains. And that's something that wasn't even a part of classical economics. They didn't anticipate that the price of assets would go up for any other reason than earning more money and capitalizing an income. And actually, what you have in the last 50 years, really since World War II, has been asset price inflation, that most families have, middle-class families, have gotten the wealth that they've got since maybe 1945, not really by saving what they've earned while working, but by the price of their house going up. They've benefited by this price of the house, and they think that that's somehow made them rich. And the reason the price of the house has gone up is that a house is worth whatever a bank is going to lend against it. And if banks have made easier credit, lower down payments, then you're going to have a financial bubble. And so now you have indeed real estate having gone up as high as it can. I don't think it can take more than 40% of somebody's income to buy it. But now if you imagine, if you're joining the labor force, you're not going to be able to buy a house at today's prices, putting down a little bit of your money, and then somehow end up getting rich just on the house investment. All of this money you pay the bank is now going to be subtracted from the amount of money that you have to spend on goods and services. So we've turned the post-war economy that made America prosperous and rich, we've turned it inside out, and somehow most people believe that you could get rich by going into debt to borrow something that's going to rise in price. And you can't get rich ultimately in going into debt. In the end, the creditors always win, and that's why every society since Sumer and Babylonia have had to either cancel the debts, or you come to a society like Rome that didn't cancel the debts, and then you have a dark age. Everything collapses.
And that's the topic of our second discussion, which is where we're headed. Thank you, Michael. And thank you for watching Days of Revolt.
Had to eat out the watermelon patch. And you know they put me in a shack